Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Zaiden, Director of the Craft in America Center in Los Angeles. Thanks so much for joining us today for this talk by three of the most talented tool makers in the country today. We're so thrilled to have the three of you with us and grateful for your time. I want to mention that the exhibition is in its final days of being on view in person, but it will live in perpetuity on craftinamerica.org. You'll be able to view objects from the show, and we'll also have a recording of this talk available in the coming weeks. And we do have one more program happening this weekend for anyone who is in Los Angeles. And it has been such a joy to host this exhibition. The response to the objects in this show by the public has been phenomenal. So thanks to everyone who's participated. We are going to start today, since this will be a very full talk with three very talented and knowledgeable makers. I'm not going to hold back any longer. We will begin with the first of our artists, and the three of you are joining us from different parts of the country. Thomas Latané is going to begin the talk today from Wisconsin. Thank you so much, Tom, for being with us. All yours to start.
I appreciate what Craft in America does to promote the creativity using the hands, heart, and mind. I think I have found here, sorry, I pushed the wrong thing. I
Or
found here the picture of the first tool that I made. Uh,
perfect.
okay, so we got the pictures up. So this is take this picture was taken in my parents' backyard outside of Baltimore. I was in high school, and that would be 16-year-old me lying on my back on the ground, sawing some boards with a friend from the neighborhood. I had both hands into the work, my full heart, but my 16-year-old mind didn't understand that there are teeth that are designed for rip sawing, which is what you're doing when you're cutting boards, and there are teeth designed for crosscut sawing. And I had found a crosscut blade. We made it work, but it was tough going. Uh, I constructed this sash saw because the shop teacher in my high school would not help me cut boards from a cedar log from which I wanted to make an art project. Uh, so inspired by illustrations in Eric Sloan's book, Museum of Early American Tools, I made this saw and cut the boards for this little chest. And after making the boards and fitting it all together, I made the hinges and I made the nails that secured the hinges. And that began a lifelong striving to do as much by hand myself as possible in any project. When I graduated high school, I went to work in my parents' backyard in a really crude timber frame shed I built for doing blacksmith work. I made items for craft shows and consignment shops. In my parents' basement, I built doll houses. I had sold a dollhouse when I was in 11th grade in a consignment shop, and that brought custom orders. So I was doing dollhouses and furniture. Uh, Toward the end of the 70s, I was growing weary of working by myself in my parents' basement, so I took 3 semesters of jewelry and metalworking with John Fix at Towson State University. This was a teapot I made later from parts that I formed in that class. I was introduced to the use of a jeweler saw, and these are jeweler saws that I made for myself later. The one with the rigid frame and the tensioning screw is the one I use all the time. I don't use the other one so much. They're heavier than jeweler saws because I'm cutting steel and often up to quarter-inch thick material using coarse blades. I tried wire inlay in that class, and these are a couple of Viking-inspired axes I made. The wires are hammered into grooves that are chiseled wider at the bottom, and therefore, when the silver spreads below the surface, it's locked into place. In 1981, I married my wife Kitty, and we moved to the Midwest. This is the bank building we bought in Pepin in 1983. We lived in it for 14 years besides working there. And at this point, this is a completely shop, display space and workspace for both of us. In 1985, I started building a blacksmith shop on the back of the building, and I worked about 7 years in a temporary shop in the basement before the blacksmith shop was done. This is the finished shop. Through the 80s, we continued building miniatures as our primary income. I really enjoyed building the structures. I did some furniture. This is an interior shop. I did furniture and other details to go in houses. Toward the end of the 80s, my customers were running out of space and they wanted to start working in smaller scales, which didn't appeal to me. So I had the idea of making facades that were 4 inches deep, with the thought that customers could spread them across a wall, taking up very little more space than pictures on the wall. But the idea never took off. In 1990, we stopped chasing the miniatures world and started raising our daughter Frances. We completely dropped out of the miniatures world. The collectors lost touch, and we were getting enough full-size orders for ironwork and woodwork, and Kitty was doing custom tin cookie cutters. Almost 30 years later, though, Bill Robertson invited us to do a show in Kansas City, so we returned for a brief step back into the miniatures world. I did this strong box. This type of thing was used for storing church and municipal funds. They generally had a couple padlocks on the front and a lock across the entire lid, so that 3 people had to have a key to get into the contents of the chest. Typically, there would be a false keyhole in the front to distract people that weren't uh, savvy about the chest. I like doing lock work very much. This is a deadbolt lock, and this is a spring-loaded lock with 2 bolts. Uh, in the early 90s, I got a grant and we went out to visit Peter Ross, who at the time was the head blacksmith at Colonial Williamsburg, and I worked with him for 3 days. And though he is doing English 18th century locks, working with him, handling original pieces, and seeing how parts were made really helped me see what was going on in locks from all different periods and uh, different countries. Lots of books have pictures, but there isn't much written about how the locks work or how they were made. This is a prototype I did for the Patient Order of Meticulous Metalsmiths, a group that got together at Urbana conferences, the Artist Blacksmith Association of North America, and built projects that were then donated to fund or to benefit the organization. This is the lock that was done at the conference based on the shape that I worked out and the internal works that I devised. This is another project the group did. This is an early one. There were only 4 of us at that point, and the 4 participants each did a self-portrait. The 4 little figures on the sides were self-portraits of the 4 blacksmiths. This is a coffee mill the group did. And the last project we did was a walnut chest. This chest I made from wood split from a walnut log. And the key for the lock in the front is hidden under the face in the escutcheon below the handle. Kitty working in the tin working area in our shop. I'm working in the blacksmith shop in the back, welding a collar on the stem of a steak anvil. I had done reduced size copies of anvils in a collector's uh, possession. Tim Chris had me do this steak anvil. This was made from salvaged wrought iron. It's 2/3 size. This one is half size. He called this style the little pig, and he called this style the church window. This is half size also. There were a number of blocks that were forge welded together, and then there's a steel plate welded across the top. I did a class at Tunnel Mill Crafts doing stake anvils, so I would end up with one for myself because uh, I've never figured a way to make income more than if I just stayed home teaching, but it gives me a chance to do something I've been wanting to do, and it puts me in a room full of people that are interested in the same thing I'm interested in. I gave the students a choice between working with inch and a half square or 1 inch square to start their anvils. This mortising chisel was made for a class I took with John Alexander. The 5/16 inch wide mortising chisel was a requirement. We did joint stools. Alexander had studied 17th century American furniture, and the one we did in the class was split out of oak. And I did two arrived walnut uh, stools after I got home. We didn't do any wood turning in the class, there wasn't time. We got a grant in 2010 to go to Norway and study with Håvard Berglund, who was a very well-known edge tool maker. Some carving tools that I made in the class, knife blades made in the class. The blades are mild steel on either side with high carbon steel welded in the middle so that the high carbon edge steel is exposed when the edge is sharpened. In the back room, between which Hobart kept running, he would teach me in the front and then go to the back, the finishing room, where Kitty was making the wooden handles, the metal fittings, and the leather sheaths for the knives. He had a battle axe that he had made as a copy of one in his family that he didn't inherit. And we didn't have time in the class, but he gave me his pattern, and I came home and made this one. But I have no use for a battle axe, so I made myself a hewing hatchet. I use that all the time. The designs on the surface are chased, which is a matter of displacing metal with chisels. The material is not removed as it is with engraving. I've never learned to engrave. These uh, dividers were inspired by Peter Ross. You see a lot of Peter Ross's influence in this show. The ones in the bottom were made after watching him demonstrate the five-leaf friction dividers. The larger wing divider at the top is was one I did in a class with Peter at Tunnel Mill. When I went home to finish it, I added the gear teeth for rack and pinion adjustment of fine adjustment of the dividers. This cage head brace was done in one of his classes. The Betty lamp was done in one of his classes. The scissors that I made for Kitty were in one of his classes. And the hacksaw at the bottom I made in one of his classes. The hacksaw above was inspired by the Dover book, Decorative Antique Ironwork. And this book has hundreds of pictures of detailed ironwork, hardly any text, but it's a great book for inspiration. The Pierce dividers were inspired by a picture in that book. When the two leaves are together, they form a tracery pattern, but between, well, the three leaves, two on the outside and one in the center. This nutcracker was inspired by a picture in the book, and the box joint pivot was taught by Peter Ross. The lion pizza cutter was inspired by another picture in that book, as was the corkscrew. The corkscrew, the pizza cutter, and the nutcracker, all things I gave to Kitty. Making things for a spouse is really nice because you can give them away. You can justify the time making them. You can give them away and you still have them. This Gothic chest was inspired by pictures in the Dover book. It's two layers of pierced steel over a piece of solid sheet. The What looks like a hinge on the right-hand side is actually the keyhole cover, which is opened when the little blocks on the face of it are turned in the right alignment, and then the key draws a bolt back, which releases the hasp on the other side. This was a tin swedge that I made for Kitty beginning at a workshop at Peter Ross's studio. This one I made for another tinsmith. It has changeable heads so that the same structure can be used with just changing the heads. This is a hammer that I made with Bloom by Lee Sauter. and the high steel bloom I got from Wayne Poitras forms the face and the peen. The wrought iron portion was soft and chased very easily, but I did have to be careful. I did lose a couple pieces because wrought iron has the slag inclusions. This is 1045 medium carbon steel. It's you can anneal it and do all the chasing cold and then harden it. This is the reverse side of that same hammer. This hammer was made for breaking chunks off a 2-pound block of chocolate. And this is a picture of the two of us in the blacksmith shop with some of our work. The hacksaw frame in the foreground on the bench is an unfinished piece. It's one of many that I have that I'm hoping to finish up in the next few years.
Thank you thank you so much for that fantastic little glimpse at decades of incredible, meticulous, flawless work. You're so inspirational to toolmakers everywhere. So thank you. And I just want to mention again to put questions in the chat, and we will come together at the end with everybody, and each artist will be able to address whatever questions anyone has. So feel free. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Austin, who is joining us from Oakland, California. And all yours, Jim. If you could turn your camera back on and unmute.
It seems my camera is disabled by the host.
We will fix that momentarily.
Am I there? Yeah.
Yes, we hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I think my video is disabled by the host.
Yes, Victoria is going to fix that.
Okay. Start my video. Okay, here we go. Hello, everybody.
We are.
First, I'd like to thank Victoria and Emily, who've been working with all of us, I guess, to help bring this entire Tools of the Trade show together. And I'm very happy that they took in a couple of pieces from me for it. I also want to greet Thomas and Seth, whose work I have admired for many years. Oops, let's see here. So as a young boy in the 60s and early 70s, I really showed no interest in making anything. However, my dad was a mechanical engineer, and he had a really nicely set up shop in the garage of our house in San Jose. So from about the ages of 9 to 17, I simply watched him for hundreds of hours as he made a really big variety of projects, from household furniture to vehicles. Next. Or no, stay on this one. Yeah, here is my dad in what I think of as his apex hobby project. This is 1970, and he designed and built a modular beach vehicle that he called the FSV-X1. It was something you could disassemble with no tools, put in a car, drive to the beach, reassemble it on the beach, and drive for, I think he said, 25 miles at a low speed. And as for myself, in 1975 in high school, I was kind of done watching him make stuff, and I was ready to make something myself. So next slide. Oh yeah, okay. So what I jumped into was scale models of artillery, and I was exclusively interested in things with bronze barrels from the 19th century and before. This was one of my first pieces. It was a quarter scale mortar with a cast and machine barrel. I wasn't really concerned too much with exact reproductions at that point. I just loved learning foundry work and using machine and hand tools for metal and wood. Next. Later, I graduated to a full-size reproduction of an 18th century British mortar with a 4¼ inch bore. And by 1980, I had also made a few field guns with wagon wheel equipped carriages. That was quite interesting. Next. So at that point, 1980, I was 22 and I was done with artillery. And at the time I was studying chemistry, and alongside my chemistry studies at San Jose State and then later at Berkeley, I started casting and finishing pewterware. These are 9-inch plates that I made the molds for in about 1981. The plates were made recently. And in the 80s, I was machining aluminum molds for them at night, sometimes overnight in the student machine shop. So next. In 1982, I decided to quit chemistry and learn a traditional craft of some sort. But through some amazing coincidences and help, I ended up leaving Berkeley and moving to Bavaria to pursue traditional craft. Next. At first, I thought I might apprentice as a pewterer, but luckily I chose blacksmithing, and I lived and worked in the town of Deason. This was my boss's house. It dates back to the 1600s, I believe, and the shop was in the back. And in the next slide, you'll see him and his wife, probably 1982. Whoops, maybe I removed that slide. Okay, yeah, that's him in his shop. In the next slide, you'll see his shop in in the back of his house, where I spent almost all of my time in this shop. It was very quaint. You can see it was remodeled, more modern than the house that is actually built into, but he had tons of collected antiques in there. I just loved it. So next slide. And during my 6 apprentice and journeyman's years there, I did a pretty wide variety of work, mostly in the surrounding community, including for a restoration of a church. And as is the case with most blacksmiths, I sometimes had to make special tools for jobs that I was working on. So in the picture of the tools there, when I started my own business in Oakland, I needed more tools than ever. And just to show you what blacksmith tools look like, here's a small selection from my current shop. And of course, after 26 years in the shop, I have quite a pile of these things, mostly organized somewhere. So let's see here. So next slide. Okay. And then one more. So here are the 2 tools I have in the tools of the trade show. On the left is a collared axe, and on the right is a forge welded hammer that I jokingly call my industrial Viking style. I like making tools that are challenging to forge, and especially if they need forge welding. The hammer on the right, I'll now follow the slide with some slides of how it was made in my shop. So next. The hammers I make, including those, they begin by stacking pieces of high carbon steel for the hard faces and on top of the bodies of low carbon steel. So on the top, you see a more clean piece of 1060 steel, high carbon, and the bottom is a soft iron body. Next. The hard and the soft steels are forge welded together at a white heat. It's almost difficult to look at it. The surface is flowing with melted flux, and with a lot of hammering, pounding, they can be bonded together into almost like one piece. So the handle holes are punched hot by hand into the bodies, even for quite heavy hammers up into the 2-kilo range. I punch those holes by hand. And the holes are refined and enlarged with a tool called a drift, which you'll see in a later slide. Next. Oops. I got a next. So the back ends of the bodies are roughly tapered to shape to form the pins of the hammer. That's the back side of the hammer that's used for different purposes than the front side. And in the next slide, you'll see the tool, the bolster, and the drift that I use for refining the shapes of the hammers. I use a power hammer for this work, usually for smaller hammers if I have a friend and I want to get him involved. And some of this can be just done on a flatter and with large fullers. One of the last steps in hammer making is typically, at least for me, is to put wedges of high carbon steel in the pins. That's the right side of each hammer, because the pins take a lot of abuse, maybe even more than the face, per square inch. And so I weld in wedges of high carbon steel there. And then in the last slide, and then in the next slide, you'll see the finished forged hammers, which are now ready to grind and harden. So let's go to the next slide. Again, back to the axe now in the picture you saw earlier. This was in the show, and it was made by the following process. So let's go to the next slide. I have some very soft steel in the shop. It's not wrought iron. It's 1005, 0.05% carbon. And I'll cut chunks of this and forge it out to dimension, meaning thickness, width, and length, usually more at the same time when I'm running the hammer. And then, next slide, I mark these out, center punch marks, and forge them in this flat form to very specific dimensions and shapes. Next slide will show that a little bit more refined. And at this point, it's ready to fold. And suddenly, in the next slide, it will become something that starts to look like an axe. So on the lower left there are two slabs of metal coming together to form a blade. And on the right side is a socket that will be closed with a lap weld. That's in the front of the socket there. The next slide indicates that the blade halves get forge welded together at very high heat to ensure, because that's a very important weld in the structure of the axe. And then the next slide shows the collar being welded together. I'm sorry, I refer to it as socket mostly. The socket is thin, less than 3/16 of an inch, and it cools fast. So this weld's a little trickier to get closed successfully. And yet burning the socket is always a concern during any high temperature process, especially forge welding, because it's so thin and because it's right next to the thickest part of the axe. At that point, the axe can be worked hot with a mandrel, which gives it a nice clean inner form for the eye and the socket. And yet it has to be used with care to avoid splitting or tearing open any of the welds. The next slide shows that I'm putting a pole on the axe. A small piece of typically high carbon steel has been shaped to fit the back of the axe. And in this axe, I'm holding it onto the back of the axe with long nose tongs, because I'll heat the upper back acute corner there in the coke fire to an extreme heat. And just the distance between the weld zone and the tip of the tongs allows them not to be destroyed during that process. And in the next slide, you'll see that welded together. The weld came out nice and clean and allowed me to form a sort of a finished styled axe from that. In the next slide, it shows putting in the important bit, the most important bit, which is actually the bit of the axe. It's a piece of high carbon steel, which is now positioned between the soft metal of the body of the axe and at the top plate. You can see the plate with the grinding on it there is an equally thick plate of the same type of steel. It covers over the bit. So all of that gets welded together and a lot of careful finish forge work is done. And I ended up with this what I think is rather attractive shape. And at this point, it was ready to grind and harden for use. So this is the start of slides showing some of the special purpose that axe makers make for this kind of work. I learned it in Scandinavia. I traveled to Sweden and Norway and kind of copied some of the tools that they were using. Here are axe tongs that are special purpose that fit the poles of the axes quite well. And in fact, they are hot fit to an axe if there's any play, because you need a really solid bite on the workpiece. In the next slide, in almost every axe making smithy in Sweden, Norway, you'll see this clamp that sits on the face of the anvil and can be used to hold the axe so that the blacksmith can work with a tool in one hand and a hammer in the other. The next slide shows the all-important mandrels. Mandrels preserve the shape of the eyes when forging is done either on the eye or near it, because the eyes are a kind of more fragile part of the axe and they can be easily deformed. Different axe models mostly need their own mandrels, and the axe maker can end up eventually with quite a few mandrels. The next slide shows a flat back mandrel, which was used for the axe in the show. And after that is a picture of a goosewing axe that I finished just a little while ago after a 40-year wait to complete that project. The goosewing form is common to Bavaria and Austria, and it has these really nice facets on it. I got pretty close to the mark on this axe, but I'm anxious to follow up with another effort. So the background for the tool forms that I made in the show are shown in the next slide that has hammers in it. These hammers are in a style I kind of, as a joke, call Viking industrial. The peaks that you see over the handle holes, they recall features in the artifact hammers from the Viking age that I mostly liked. I liked more than all the others, in other words. But these versions that I use in my shop in different sizes are more compact and squared off than the originals, but they have great balance and rebound. And the axe that I have in the show, forged in a very close style to this piece, as part of a series. It was inspired by Finnish axes, in other words, axes from Finland that have very acutely high pointed backs on the poles, and often they have very accentuated weld lines between the pole and the axe. Rather than blend it together, they actually make it kind of a detail. And the next slide shows an actual Finnish antique axe that shows these features: very down-angled blade and an acute angle up in the upper back of the axe, along with a very defined detail between the axe and the pole. Most of my axes have gone to friends and collectors, but I'm really enthusiastic about providing hewing and joinery axes to timber framers and traditional house builders. This picture shows my friend and early supporter Henning Olstad in Norway. I sent this axe to him. It's about a 7-inch hewing axe in maybe 10 years ago. And he tested it out and gave it a really good review. And then finally, last year, I visited him again, 2024, and I saw the axe again. I was really, really happy to see it in his hands, still in his toolbox. And the next slide, actually a small video, shows the hewing axe that you saw in the earlier picture. It is in the hands of a timber framer in Massachusetts, and he gave me good reviews on the axe, but said I needed to change the balance. So I'll be making him another one and moving the weight a little higher up in the blade. And I have to say, I just find this work really mesmerizing to watch, and I look forward to visiting him later this year. So that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jim. Just fantastic to get this encapsulated story of your work. Thank you. So next we're going to switch to Seth Gould, who's joining us from Massachusetts. So we've covered the whole country in terms of where you're all located today. Anyway, Seth, and then we'll reconvene.
Great. Thank you. Can you see everything all right? Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here today. I'm very grateful to be here and talking to you all. And thank you, Crafton America, for such a wonderful exhibition. I'm really honored to be presenting alongside Jim and Tom, who are both blacksmiths that I've looked up to for a long time. To start off, I just thought I would show the tools that I have in the show. Everything here except for one of the chasing hammers and the screwdriver are part of the exhibition in LA right now. These are all my personal tools, but most of them serve as kind of a master copy, if you will, for when I make small batches of tools that I sell. To give a little bit of background to how I started out, I'm from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This is a picture of the automotive repair shop that my grandfather started in 1949. I kind of grew up in this shop, and although many aspects were updated, it really maintained the atmosphere of extreme orderliness that you can see in this picture. I never really saw that side of myself, the orderliness side of myself, until I started working in metal. But once I did, it became really apparent that I enjoyed making things with a certain level of meticulousness. And also, although I never really took to the automotive repair, I think being in this environment certainly gave me a real appreciation for working with my hands and the importance of the right tools. I ended up going to college for metalsmithing and jewelry design. And after being out of school for a couple of years, I was accepted into a 2-year fellowship at the Penland School of Craft. Penland is a craft school in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and it's a place where students can take classes with guest instructors from anywhere from 1 to 8 weeks. They have a couple of longer term programs as well, one being the core fellowship, which is what I moved there to do. It was a really incredible opportunity, and I was able to work for the school part-time in exchange for enrollment in basically all the classes I could handle for 2 years. And during that time, I was really able to develop my work and my craft under the guidance and influence of some of the best metalsmiths in the field and blacksmiths. Later, I returned to the school as a resident artist for 3 years, but it was during my time as a core fellow that I made some of the first meaningful and real tools that I'd made. It's funny hearing Tom talk so much about Peter because I'm going to talk about him a little bit too. But Peter is an incredible influence to blacksmithing and tool making all over. So during my time at Penland, during that core fellowship, I had the opportunity to work with Peter. And like Tom said, he was the master Smith at Colonial Williamsburg for 25 years. He had been retired at that point from that position, but he's one of the foremost experts on colonial ironwork in the country. I studied locksmithing and tool making while working with him. And his understanding and approach to forging and ironwork really resonated with me on many levels. Kind of set the foundation for how I approach making objects to this day. And working with Peter, I learned to work in a much different way than I think a lot of people are conditioned to going into other programs. Because the way he works is based in pre-industrial revolution mentality. Each piece he makes is, made for its specific place. There are no standardized parts. Each piece is made to fit the previous one. And for me, this means a much more organic way of working, which is really more conducive to the creative process in general, I'd say. So finally, to the actual tool making. Tool making has become a large part of my career. And for me, making tools has always had the greatest reward. The process of creating something that you can then use, and the experience and feeling is something that I don't think I'll ever get tired of. And furthermore, really my ultimate goal in tool making is to not only make a tool that functions to the best of its ability, but also to make a really beautiful object, something that I or the user will love and admire. I sounds kind of like a tagline, but I honestly believe that using tools that inspire you leads to, a more enjoyable experience. And ultimately that leads to creating better work. I personally surround myself with tools that inspire me, and I hope that the tools I make can do the same for artists and craftsmen whose hands they end up in. The most common way I make tools is in kind of small production runs. These I'll make periodically, although it's been a couple of years due to a big move and a new building of a shop and larger projects that I've been working on. But these runs of tools typically range anywhere from just a few tools to several dozen, depending on what I'm making. Repetition is a big part of making these, and I have come to really enjoy honing my skills through making small batches like this. There is definitely a historic precedent for many of the tools that I make. I'm by no means a reproduction blacksmith, but I'm heavily influenced by historic work, and I'm often borrowing a pattern that already exists or existed a couple hundred years ago, and I'm trying to find my own way to present it, in my own interpretation of that. And although there's a number of customers who end up simply collecting my tools, it is my intention to have these tools last generations when they're put to work. This is a photo I caught of blacksmith Haley Woodward with a pair of my dividers after several years of use. And it always brings me a lot of joy to see my tools being used in the hands of capable makers. Most of what I make starts in a coal forge, and the metal's heated and then forged to shape. As you saw through Jim's slides, forging is the process of forming and shaping the metal while it's hot. It can be done cold as well. And I'm either doing this at the anvil or with a hammer in hand, or using a machine called a power hammer, which kind of allows me to manipulate larger material, and can also act as a sort of a third hand when I need it. This picture shows a brief step-by-step of making a pair of dividers. So dividers are used to mark, measure, or do layout in a number of disciplines. This photo shows the raw material on the far left. In the middle is the finished forging, and on the right is the final product. And this style of three-leaf dividers and wing dividers, which I also learned to make from Peter Ross, is particularly interesting to me because of how it's made. This is, my take on that pattern, that historic pattern that's been made for hundreds of years. But even with today's technology, the most efficient way to make this tool is at the anvil. And when it comes to tool making, or really forging in general, the allure of moving hot metal and the challenge of creating accurate forgings is something that will always be intriguing to me. The majority of my work gets refined further after forging, so I'm always trying to create a forging that is as close to the end product as possible before moving on to the next step. Most of the finished work is done at the bench with files. This is my primary workbench, and you'll see vices, files, and most importantly, good natural light. I'm by no means opposed to power tools, and they definitely have a place in my shop. I use them often, but finishing and refining work by hand is the way that I prefer. Becoming proficient with hand tools in general, whether at the forge or at the bench, is something I definitely take pride in, and ultimately, it's the way I enjoy working most. And so much like historic work from the 18th and 19th century, my work is filed to finish. And so light reflection is a key to making successful work in this way. Each surface is treated in controlled and intentional file work, which allows the light to kind of read differently depending on which place it's reflecting from. And a large amount of the decorative work is done with files as well. You can see kind of those coves and beads are all done with files. So this is a chasing hammer head, and chasing hammers are used primarily for striking other tools, either in engraving or chasing in repoussé. And chasing hammers have a really specific design for their purpose. They have a front weighted face and a thin flexible handle that provides spring and flex for repeated small hammer blows. These are two sizes that I make regularly, and this was a special order. So these specifically are handled with Osage orange wood, but I use hickory for almost all my other hammer handles. Beyond the function, finish, and forging, something that I appreciate is the combination of other materials. Working primarily in steel and iron can make for a pretty limiting palette, so the introduction of wood and other metals is a welcome change. This detail of a hacksaw shows the transition from the filed steel saw frame, then to the machine brass ferrule, and then into the turned ebony handle. And this combination of texture, color, and material has always been a favorite of mine. For some tools, like these jeweler saws, I offer different handle options. Here's ebony, mahogany, and boxwood. And as an alternative way of adding options and color, I've also started offering some tools with inlay as a decorative element. So on the top there, you can see the dividers have brass inlay instead of just a filed line. And Tom talked about this a little bit, but inlay is the process of embedding softer material kind of into the base metal as a decorative element. And looking at the entire scope of my studio practice, my work ranges from, these relatively simple tools to highly embellished utilitarian objects such as locks and boxes. These small batches of tools help create a really nice balance for me in the studio. When I'm working on a batch of tools, I can really go into production mode and just kind of get to work. I don't have to do too much problem solving. I don't have to think too much. By the time I'm done with a batch of tools, I'm usually eager to get into something that will challenge me and design with design complexity, things like that. Um, like the lock there on the right. And then about the time I'm burnt out of problem solving, and being in my head all the time from a more ambitious piece, I turn back to tool making, and it's just kind of time to cruise again. So I'll also periodically make one-of-a-kind pieces or one-of-a-kind sets of tools. This is a set that is one of those examples. And in this version, they all have matching Brazilian rosewood handles and brass details. And there's actually kind of some version of each of these tools in the exhibit. Not these tools exactly, but a version of these. And so for a piece like this, I'll often use wrought iron. Wrought iron is a material that's no longer produced. It has beautiful forging qualities, but it's been replaced by modern steel. Steel has always been produced, but at higher costs. So historically, labor was cheap, steel was expensive. So on a tool like a hammer, the more expensive and durable steel would be welded to wrought iron. This is the same sort of thing Jim was talking about. And although this would take more time, it was ultimately cheaper to make tools in this way. So these pictures show how I prep the steel by creating barbs on the steel faces, and then I sink the barbs into the hot wrought iron body of the hammer, and finally heat the entire stack up to a forge welding temperature, which when hammered together permanently bonds the materials. And this is a much more labor-intensive way for me to make a hammerhead as well. But in the end, you can see evidence of the process. I love that little detail on the left where there's just kind of that wisp of barb left over. And it adds another layer to the tool, creating a subtle but really beautiful detail that alludes to how it was made and kind of is a nod to tool making history. The one specific piece that I thought it would be interesting to highlight from the exhibit is this small hand vise. It's only about 5 inches long, and this one is made from case-hardened steel and carbon steel. Although after the fact, I made a couple more out of some material that I got from Jim and fully case-hardened them. So there's always learning. Historically, a vise like this would have been used for holding small parts or filing or fitting by a jeweler or maybe a goldsmith or a watchmaker. But they're still really useful in any small workshop. I have a collection of these of old ones, and I've always wanted to make a version. So when I set out to make that Brazilian rosewood set, it was the perfect excuse to figure out how to make them and make one for myself as well. This tool has a great balance of technical forging and fine file work with, some fun details like the crossed hatched jaws and a hole that goes all the way through for holding longer material. And it's this type of object or tool that really keeps me going. It's pushing my own skills to produce something that I'm proud of and excited about. And to end, I just wanted to share something kind of personal in regards to this exhibition. It has to do with the lineage I see on the walls of the gallery. There are people that I look up to and learn from as a younger smith, like Tom and Jim, long before I knew what I was doing, and certainly long before I could call myself a toolmaker. But I also am seeing students of mine in the exhibition. People like Rachel Kenninger, Elias Sedaris, and Max Grossman were all students of mine at one point, and each have some beautiful tools in the exhibit. And then I see my tools right in the middle of all of them. So, just in this slide alone, I see tools that I was inspired by, tools that I made, and tools made by students of mine. And to see kind of generations throughout the show is really meaningful. So, thanks again to Craft in America for putting together such a wonderful exhibit. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Seth. And absolutely, I think that's been an ongoing premise and concept that's come through with the exhibition and visitation to the exhibition is this idea of the connectivity, not just of you all as tool makers, but generationally and to those who taught you, and now you all being teachers yourselves, passing this on, and really that this is so indicative of how people learn craft, this personal connection. So, and the tools I think are the physical evidence of the connections as well. So thank you for pointing that out. Thank you all. We have a couple questions to address here. I want to start, actually first wanted to see if, since you all do teach, aside from where you are all teaching, which of course everyone attending, please, we'll try to get your websites in the chat in a moment, but you three are tremendous resources on that front. Any other ways that you encourage someone who's starting out to learn, to jump into this field? You all found your pathways in such unique ways. What would you say to someone starting? Feel free, anyone who wants to jump in. Yeah.
What I would say is when you take a class, go home and do it again to make sure that the things you learned are well embedded in your mind and in your hands.
Fabulous. Any other go-to resources? Yes, Jim?
I would also say people ought to take a lot of, make a lot of sketches. They should make tracings and study their process in detail, at least when they have a little bit of grasp of what's going on, so they can make faster progress and build on what they have learned. The other thing I would say is don't wait for permission, just do it. And by the time you find somebody to teach, you'll have a better idea of how to learn.
Yeah, and I was just going to say also that I'm a big proponent of the craft schools that are out there that you can take classes at, places like Haystack and Penland and Aramont and Center for Metal Arts, and there's a long list of them. And if you can go take a class there, they're really incredible resources with so much knowledge packed into the time that you spend at those places.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for mentioning Penland in your presentation as well. I'm going to start looking into the questions. So for Tom, any books kind of following in this idea of resources, but books and other resources for learning and specifically chasing steel, similar to how you work?
I don't know about that. And after watching the earlier program, I was trying to think about books, and nothing comes to mind. I'm sure it's out there, but I took the class at Towson State and did some chasing, and just done a lot of practice since.
Yeah, and that's definitely very clear from our work on this exhibition. There's very little published, and in fact, there's a question queued up about that as well. Very little in terms of publications to access in terms of this realm, its history and technique and whatnot. There's very few sources, but Seth or Jim, anything to add in terms of documentation and sources?
Me? Uh, well, I guess there's the Diderot Encyclopedia, which has a lot of at least tools, but I think they cover some process. And
Mhm.
even if it's not necessarily applicable, like I'm thinking about a whole series of engravings on anchor making,
Mhm.
where they show a technique called piling, which is kind of what I may be faced with soon on some axes to make some really heavy, curvy blades. And it's just like, well, that idea didn't come from, it's not anchor making, but you can cross pollinate your different experiences into something new and something that's important to you a lot of times.
What a great thought to look at, such a historic text and a primarily visual text too, for that matter. And yeah, that really is indicative of what you all do, that it's a practice that has so much history to it, and that going back to those sources probably is the key.
Mhm. My experience with axe making, since I'm mostly interested in Swedish and Norwegian, is I just went there, and people like to criticize Facebook a lot, but my whole first month in Norway and Sweden was organized on Facebook,
Mhm.
and I went over to study with people and to do some teaching over there.
Exactly, yes, and Tom as well, in terms of international study. And I'm not sure, Seth, if you also have looked internationally on that front,
Yeah,
but
yeah, I didn't the slideshow is only so long, but I have a whole thing about being influenced by a lot of historic work that I saw in person in Europe. And then there's a whole other side of my career that's influenced by Japanese metalwork as well. So, and the one thing that I'd say isn't kind of for resources wise is for me, there's nothing more valuable than a physical example of something. So just find, if there's something you want to make, if it exists or part of it exists in any way, if you can either see it in person in a museum or if it's something that's common enough that you can own a copy yourself. I have drawers and drawers full of things that are inspirational that, it pays to be able to take a measurement from or look at or study. And that's kind of just as valuable as any sort of book that's going to tell you. And there really aren't books out there to tell you so. It's more valuable.
yes.
Back to the book question. I can't remember if it was Donna Maylock, but somebody had put out a book called Moving Metal. And I remember reading about repousse in that, but there may have been some about chasing in that also.
Great.
Studying-
Sorry, go
Oh, I
ahead.
was just going to say, studying original pieces is really the best thing to be able to do if you can. Museums, I suppose. I bought a lot of axes from Sweden and Norway 5, 10 years ago, just to have something to look at in my own hands, because I can't go to museums over there. It's hard enough to get back east. But looking for forge welding solutions, which are often very difficult to discern in pieces. Sometimes it's almost better to get a broken tool or something made by a really inexpert person in the vein of, whatever kind of axe. And it's easier to decode that way.
Excellent. Very different perspective in terms of research and knowledge and where to seek it, and really important. Um, Different fuel sources for each of you. One of the questions we have coming through.
I'm working in bituminous coal. Like that's what I forge in all the time. Mhm.
I've been burning wood and charcoal ever since I started.
Great. Jim?
Uh, I live in California, so coal is not an option here. I wish it was, because I learned in coal in Germany. I use coke kind of secretly in my shop, and I love it best for the forge welds, but I can do them in gas too.
Fabulous. Okay. And also, Jim, question, Flatter and Cooper and the purposes of those tools. We have a question.
A flatter and a what?
Cooper.
Cooper. I don't think I mentioned a Cooper, but flatters are top tools for blacksmiths that are usually, well, they'd be struck almost always by a striker. I guess you can use them yourself. They're just what they do, what the name says. They make things flat, not necessarily parallel. You can use them to taper things, but if you've hammered something roughly and you want a clean surface, then a flatter is a great tool to use.
Thank you. Seth, you love file work. This is true among various processes. And do you have a particular make of file you recommend?
Oh, the question everyone wants to know. Yeah, no, not exactly. The thing I always say is that a new file is better than a used file. And if there's new old stock out there, that's kind of the best. The older American files are really nice, but that's kind of hard to come by. So just buy new sharp files, and that's the best that you're going to get probably.
We have a question from an amateur blacksmith in southern Chile, where there's no formal masters in blacksmithing available, and struggling with forge welding. This person usually works with gas. Advice for this person, Eduardo?
Well, if it's in gas, it's not really different than in coke or charcoal or anything. Most people just don't hit a high enough temperature, or they work in a small fire that's too small to get a full heat on their piece. So you just go oversize on the fire. You might want to burn a few things just to see how to stay short of burning, but you need to reach the temperature. And other than that, I would look for as many YouTubes as possible of people doing it in front of the camera and just try to get the moves down.
Great.
And find somebody who can show it to you as soon as possible.
Super. We have a question about back to publishing and I think very clear this network of information that exists, but that is not accessible and so much in terms of print. But wondering if anyone's going to be publishing anything in terms of methods and techniques, especially for beginners. Any word of someone who's working on
So personally, I don't have plans to. I've thought about that, realizing kind of the lack of information that's available of this sorts of things. But on a personal level, I feel like I want to pay my dues first. I don't like it when people put information out there too soon. I want to feel good about it. With that said, I'd love to read something that Jim wrote or that Tom wrote. I feel like they've paid their dues. So
I feel like I should write a book once I learn how to make about 10 more axes, but that'll be a while, and I'm getting older, so we'll see. I do feel that three-dimensional scanning and model printing could be a huge help for some axe making that's complicated, because in the finished axe, if it's well done, you can almost not back engineer how it was done. And that's why I'd say like an axe that is made broken and sometimes shows internal structures is the only, a good way to find out. But it would be possible to make an axe and scan the forged pieces as they progress through the process, and show anybody, like, to a very high degree of accuracy, how the work progresses. And that's the hardest part to learn. I have a Viking axe model on a website that a friend helped me on a long time ago, that it's kind of amazing to look at, but you can see, if you see the steps close enough together, it's easy to understand. It's just you can't normally find that.
We've definitely gone over by several minutes, and you all are the most precise of craftspeople. So I want to be attentive to that. Last question. Do you each work alone, or do you have assistants? And have any of you taken apprentices, for that matter? especially having come through this process, Jim?
I work alone, and the way I work doesn't really lend itself to having an apprentice around, because I have to jump around to so many different things that it'd be really hard to keep somebody busy. So, and then there's California employment law too. So it's I get helpers sometimes, you know. It's always easy to find somebody. If you say you're going to forge weld an axe together, you can usually find somebody with a day or so notice to help you.
Great. Tom, you work with your wife, Kitty, to some extent.
She's often there to lend a hand. Yeah, I generally work alone, but what I like to do is to have social forging days where I'll get together with some other blacksmiths that have similar projects and we'll work and visit and compare notes.
Nice.
And Seth?
Yeah, I work alone. Kind of my workload doesn't really isn't conducive to supporting more than myself in the shop, and kind of same as Jim was saying in terms of keeping someone else busy. But I've always kind of wanted to do the same thing that Tom's talking about too. I'd love to be a little bit more social with what I'm doing. And so hopefully in my future maybe that'll happen.
I suppose teaching at the various craft schools, though, has that element to it. So
Definitely. Yeah, there's and kind of again, I think Tom kind of mentioned something like this. When I teach, it's as much about getting to it's not so much a job. It's not for the money. It's to get to meet people, connect with people, share the information. And yeah.
okay, well, thank you all for this phenomenal look at what you do. Keep going. It's inspirational to all of us. Your meticulous attentiveness to your work is just incredible. So thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for watching.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.